No one expected TS moment to happen on live TV, but when it did, the entire nation gasped. It began as just another broadcast, bright studio lights blazing, cameras humming, anchors shuffling their papers, the kind of political segment viewers had seen 100 times before. But in a single heartbeat, the air changed. You could feel it even through the screen. Maxine Waters, the veteran firebrand known for her sharp tongue and fearless defiance, leaned forward in her chair with that unmistakable steel in her eyes. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a younger face in the political arena, unshaken, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. The set was tense before either of them spoke a word. This wasn't just an interview. It was a powder keg, waiting for the spark. The moderator tried to maintain composure, introducing topics with the neutral tone of broadcast professionalism. But the energy between the two women pushed past him, commanding the stage. Then, the moment erupted. Waters cut in sharply, her voice slicing through the air like a blade firm, commanding, daring anyone to challenge her authority. Viewers at home straightened in their seats, sensing they were about to witness something that would be replayed for years. Crockett didn't flinch. She met Waters' words with a calm defiance, a steady gaze that said more than any rebuttal could. The silence that followed was electric, pulsing through the studio, as though every person in the room understood history was tilting on its axis. One spoke from the weight of decades in politics, the other from the fire of a new generation, unwilling to be silenced. And as the exchange unfolded, millions across the country found themselves holding their breath. Social feeds lit up instantly, phones buzzed with alerts, and commentators scrambled to prepare their takes. This wasn't just a clash of opinions, it was a collision of eras, a battle of identities, a moment so raw and unfiltered that it broke through the noise of ordinary political theater. But what happened next didn't just shock the studio, it sent shockwaves across the nation, and by the time the final words were spoken, the ending left millions stunned. To understand why this moment mattered so deeply, you have to see beyond the sound bites and the flashing studio lights. This was never just about two women trading words. It was about the collision of two legacies, two visions of power, two Americas that had been waiting, almost inevitably, to meet head-on. Maxine Waters had long been a towering figure in political life. For decades she carved her place as a fighter, feared by her opponents and admired by her base. Her voice carried the weight of seniority, the kind of authority only years of battles could forge. She had weathered storms, taken blows, and delivered some of her own with unmatched force. To many, she embodied resistance, a symbol of endurance. But endurance alone can harden into something else, into unyielding pride, into the expectation that one's word is final, unchallenged. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett represented something undeniably different. She was younger, hungrier, and rooted in a generation that saw politics not as a fortress to be guarded, but as a system that could be remade. Her rise was rapid, her voice sharp with clarity, her energy restless with purpose. Where Waters carried decades of scars, Crockett carried the urgency of now, the insistence that truth should not wait for permission. To many who had felt unseen or dismissed, Crockett was not just a politician. She was a reflection of their struggle and their pride. This wasn't merely a generational divide, it was an ideological chasm. Waters spoke in the language of tradition, of defending hard-won ground, of commanding respect through force. Crockett spoke in the language of disruption, of demanding recognition, of insisting that dignity does not have to shout to be heard. For progressives, immigrants, young activists, and countless women watching, this was a face-off that touched more than politics. It touched identity itself. The tension had been simmering for months, hinted at in smaller jabs and subtle moments on Capitol Hill, whispered about in private circles and speculated on in the press. But here, under the unblinking eye of live television, there was no filter. The clash was inevitable, and every viewer knew that what unfolded would carry consequences far beyond this broadcast. For women in politics, especially women of color, this moment was layered with even deeper weight. Representation is never just symbolic, it is personal, visceral. Every glare, every retort, every ounce of composure or eruption was being read as more than individual behavior. It was read as a reflection of possibility. Could a younger generation stand toe-to-toe with an established icon? Could dignity rooted in calm conviction outlast authority, fueled by sheer force of will? And then there was the question that kept millions glued to their screens: who would break first? The veteran with decades of dominance behind her, or the newcomer with a growing wave of support swelling beneath her? The answer would matter, not just for the night's ratings, but for the future conversation about women, leadership, and the very meaning of power in America. What happened next would rewrite the conversation about women in politics, because in this clash, It was never just about policy points or debating styles. It was about who owned the moment, and how that ownership would ripple outward into culture, community, and history. But as the exchange deepened, words sharpened, and pride dug in its heels, the confrontation threatened to slip past the boundaries of ordinary debate. The audience could sense it. This was more than sparring. It was turning into something rawer, riskier, more dangerous. And soon, the insults and power plays would escalate beyond anything the cameras, or the country, were prepared for. To understand the weight of this showdown, you need to step back and look at the long, complicated shadow cast by Maxine Waters. For decades, she has been a fixture in American politics, an unmistakable presence, a woman who refused to be silenced in rooms where power was almost always male, almost always white, and almost always against her. Her voice was sharp, her convictions unflinching. To many, she was a warrior, a symbol of fire that could not be extinguished. But fire, when it burns too long, can scorch as easily as it can illuminate. Waters built her reputation on confrontation. She was never the kind of politician who softened her edges for approval. Instead, she thrived on sharpening them. When others backed away, she leaned forward. When critics warned her to stay quiet, she raised her voice louder. That defiance made her a beacon to those who longed for boldness in an era of half measures. She called out presidents. She challenged financial giants. She branded her enemies with nicknames that stuck. And for her supporters, this wasn't arrogance. It was bravery. But every firebrand risks becoming consumed by the very flames they wield. Waters' critics painted her as reckless, dismissing her style as grandstanding rather than leadership. They accused her of chasing spectacle instead of solutions, of basking in the glow of controversy, while sidestepping the slow, unglamorous work of building bridges. Over time, those accusations stuck with some viewers, creating a portrait of a woman both admired and feared, respected for her stamina, but questioned for her tone. And yet, her longevity in politics was proof of her resilience. Waters didn't just survive the harshest storms, she seemed to thrive in them. When others stumbled under pressure, she seemed to rise. For those who felt voiceless, she offered a model of defiance. Her speeches lit up rallies. Her fiery one-liners ricocheted across news cycles, reminding her allies that she was never afraid to say what others wouldn't. In a system that often demanded compromise, she was uncompromising. But that uncompromising edge had a cost. In private, even some allies whispered about her volatility. Younger progressives sometimes rolled their eyes at her style, seeing in it not just courage but ego. The very qualities that had made her legendary also made her vulnerable. A reputation built on dominance meant that every challenge to her authority was more than disagreement. It was personal, and that personal edge made every confrontation combustible. Waters carried herself like a general in battle, every word a weapon, every glare a warning. She knew her presence alone could command a room, and for years, it had. She relished in being the voice others were too timid to echo. But her greatest strength, her refusal to yield, was also the root of her critics' doubts. Was she a protector of the people, or a protector of her own legacy? In this light, her encounter with Jasmine Crockett was more than just another debate. For Waters, it was instinctively about hierarchy, about reminding the nation, and this rising newcomer, that experience still ruled over ambition. She had faced countless rivals before, sparred with seasoned opponents, and rarely backed down. To her, this was yet another chance to prove that she was untouchable. But to the millions watching, something about this confrontation felt different. Waters' style, once thrilling, now carried an edge of fatigue. Her voice, still thunderous, sometimes seemed less about clarity and more about control. And against the composure of Crockett's rising star, that difference was impossible to ignore. Maxine Waters was a titan, no doubt. A fighter, a survivor, a force. She had carved her place in history through grit and audacity, and no one could strip that from her. But titans carry the weight of their own mythology, and in mythology, every giant eventually meets someone who refuses to be crushed. Waters had faced critics, rivals, and enemies before. She had stared down the most powerful figures in American politics and walked away unbroken. But she had never faced a challenger quite like this. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's presence in that studio carried such electricity, you have to trace the path that brought her there. A path carved not by privilege or ease, but by grit, determination, and a refusal to apologize for being exactly who she was. Crockett's story is not the story of a political dynasty or a carefully scripted rise through party machinery. Hers is a story born in struggle, sharpened in skepticism, and elevated by the courage to stand firm in a world that often demanded she shrink. From the beginning, Crockett carried herself differently. She wasn't groomed to play politics the old way. She wasn't a backroom dealmaker, nor was she someone content to climb ladders slowly, handshakes and compromises paving each rung. Instead, she came from the school of survival, of working harder, speaking louder, and daring to show up in spaces where others doubted she belonged. As a young black woman stepping into the storm of American politics, she knew the odds were not in her favor. But odds never stopped her. They fueled her. Her legal career had already marked her as someone unwilling to be intimidated. In courtrooms where silence and compliance were often the unspoken rules, Crockett brought energy, directness, and a fierce sense of justice. Clients saw in her not just a lawyer, but an advocate who refused to flinch when the system bore down. Each case, each late night preparation, each confrontation with authority trained her to stare down intimidation and answer it with clarity. She learned early what many in politics only discover too late, that dignity isn't handed to you. You defend it every single day. But politics was a harsher battlefield. It wasn't just about policy or procedure. It was about identity, about perception, about the unforgiving glare of the public eye. Crockett entered that world knowing she would be judged differently. Every word, every gesture, every flash of emotion would be dissected not just as a politician's performance, but as a reflection of her race, her gender, her generation. Where others could afford missteps, she would be scrutinized. Where others could afford anger, she would be branded as too much. And still, she pressed forward. Crockett wasn't interested in playing safe or conforming to a mold that had never been made for her. She embraced her unapologetic authenticity as her greatest weapon. When she spoke, it wasn't with the cautious hedging of career politicians. It was with the lived certainty of someone who understood what it meant to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to be told to wait her turn. And in that certainty, people found not just a politician, but a reflection of their own frustrations, their own pride, their own hope. Her rise wasn't without its bruises. Critics called her inexperienced, brash, even naive. Some accused her of chasing moments instead of building alliances. Others warned her that her tone was too sharp, her words too direct, her stance too bold. But for every critic, there were countless supporters who saw those very qualities as the reason she mattered. She wasn't in politics to blend in. She was there to change the rhythm of the room. And perhaps what set her apart most was not just her fire, but her composure. Crockett had a way of holding herself in the storm that made people take notice. Where others yelled, she could pause. Where others postured, she could stay grounded. That calm was not weakness, it was power. The kind of power that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone rewrite it. It was this calm, this bravery in truth, this dignity under pressure, that made her such a potent force against the loudest voices in politics. For immigrants watching, for young women of color searching, for someone who looked like them on the national stage, Crockett became a kind of compass. Her rise said something unspoken, but deeply felt that belonging is not granted by gatekeepers. It is claimed by those who refuse to be excluded. She carried herself not as someone begging for a seat at the table, but as someone building a new one altogether. This was the energy she brought into that studio. Not arrogance, not defiance for defiance's sake, but a quiet strength that unsettled those used to commanding without question. Crockett had learned long ago that storms would come, insults would fly, and doubt would be her constant shadow. But she had also learned that truth, spoken with dignity, has a way of cutting through even the thickest noise. And so, when the cameras turned on, Crockett was ready. The air inside the studio thickened as the conversation shifted from polite introductions to pointed exchanges. What began as structured talking points quickly transformed into a duel. The kind of duel that doesn't need swords because words, tone, and timing carry all the sharpness required. Maxine Waters leaned forward, her voice booming with authority as she fired her first salvo. It was not a gentle nudge, not a subtle critique. It was a cutting remark designed to remind everyone watching who had the longest tenure in the room. She spoke of experience, of scars earned in political warfare, of battles fought long before Crockett's career had even begun. Her words were laced with an unmistakable edge. You have not earned the right to stand equal with me. The studio fell into a hush. Even the moderator, accustomed to heated debates, seemed momentarily stunned by the bluntness. Cameras instinctively zoomed in on Waters' face. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw set, her body angled forward like a general daring an adversary to step closer. But Crockett didn't flinch. She adjusted her posture, straightened in her chair, and let the silence linger just long enough to suggest composure rather than retreat. Then she answered. Her voice was steady, precise, a measured rebuttal that carried the weight of calm conviction. She did not raise her volume, she did not match Waters' fury. Instead, she dismantled the argument piece by piece, weaving her response with a clarity that made the contrast impossible to ignore. The audience watching at home could feel the tension building with every sentence. Social feeds erupted, clips were already being clipped, reactions already forming. Commentators who had tuned in expecting a routine exchange were suddenly scrambling to find words to describe what was unfolding. This was no longer politics as usual. Waters struck again, this time sharper, her words barbed with years of practiced rhetorical dominance. She invoked history, invoked loyalty, invoked the authority that comes with decades in the trenches. The cadence of her voice thundered across the set. Her gestures grew more pronounced, her finger pointing, her hands slicing the air, as if each movement could carve her dominance into the space. And yet, Crockett countered with the same unshakable poise. She leaned in only slightly, enough to signal she was not retreating. Her tone remained firm, her words cutting not through volume but through precision. With each response, she reminded the audience that a new generation of leaders didn't need to shout to command attention. They only needed to speak with truth. By now, even the crew behind the cameras felt it, the unusual stillness of a room caught between two forces. The lighting seemed brighter, the silence heavier, every shuffle of paper or cough amplified by the tension. Journalists in the green room whispered to one another, stunned by how quickly this had escalated from scripted dialogue to a showdown. The body language told its own story. Waters' movements grew restless, her eyes darting toward Crockett as if daring her to falter. Crockett, in contrast, sat grounded, her hands calm, her gaze unwavering. The juxtaposition was cinematic, one woman burning hot, the other standing in quiet defiance. The nation was watching a generational clash, live and unfiltered. Every word felt like it could tip the balance. Viewers leaned closer to their screens, unwilling to look away. Some felt outrage, others felt vindication, but all felt the undeniable electricity of a moment too raw to script. The escalation was reaching its peak. One wrong word, one flash of temper, and the confrontation could erupt into something irreversible. And just when the tension seemed unbearable, when the silence between their sentences felt like the whole country was holding its breath. But then, the unthinkable happened. The studio hung in suspended silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty but vibrating, as if the air itself knew what was about to happen. Waters had spoken with all the force of her career, all the weight of her authority, daring anyone, especially the younger woman across from her, to try and match it. The tension was suffocating, yet in that moment, Jasmine Crockett did something remarkable. She didn't rush, didn't scramble, didn't falter. She breathed, waited, and let the silence serve her. It was the silence of confidence, the silence of someone who understood that anticipation could be more powerful than any opening line. When she finally spoke, her words were deliberate, steady, and aimed directly at the heart of Waters' attack. She began not with fire but with calm, not with rage but with measured clarity. "With all due respect," she said, her voice cutting clean through the stillness. "Experience means nothing if it teaches you to silence the very voices you claim to represent." The line landed with precision, not a sledgehammer but a scalpel, slicing into the armor of seniority that Waters wore so proudly. Gasps fluttered through the audience. It wasn't volume that created the impact, it was restraint. Crockett spoke like someone who knew every syllable mattered, who understood that the power of truth is magnified when delivered without haste. Her tone carried the quiet confidence of someone unwilling to bend. Not because she sought confrontation, but because she stood in conviction. Waters shifted in her chair. The camera caught it, the slightest tightening of her jaw, the brief flicker in her eyes. For the first time in the exchange, the veteran seemed unsettled. She attempted to reassert herself, interjecting with a reminder of her decades in office, her long fight for marginalized communities. But Crockett didn't allow the weight of history to smother the moment. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, her gaze locked, her presence steady. She spoke again, each sentence like a stone laid carefully on a foundation of dignity. Respect is not measured by how long you've held a seat. Respect is measured by how you carry the seat while you have it. And too often, the people looking up at power see pride instead of service. The words were not shouted, yet they seemed to echo louder than anything Waters had said that night. The audience murmured, whispers rippling through the crowd like the first signs of an oncoming storm. The moderator shifted uncomfortably, sensing the ground shifting beneath the discussion. Social media, already ablaze, erupted further, viewers typing furiously, cutting clips, declaring that they were witnessing more than debate, they were witnessing a turning point. Hashtags began to trend even before the exchange had concluded, each one echoing Crockett's composure. Waters tried once more to seize control, raising her hand, her voice firm, even cutting. But Crockett's rebuttals came not as interruptions, but as revelations. She paused after every phrase, giving the nation time to absorb the sting. She framed herself not as a challenger to Waters personally, but as a challenger to the very idea that authority alone grants truth. And that framing, subtle but relentless, pressed Waters into a corner she had never known. Generations fought for this seat. Waters said with force, "You stand on shoulders that bled so you could even sit here." Crockett nodded, her eyes softening for a moment, acknowledging the truth in that history. Then, after the pause, she answered, "Yes. And because of those shoulders, I refuse to bow mine now." It was the kind of statement that sent shivers down spines. It honored the past while refusing to be chained by it. It was reverence without submission. And it landed with a power that no shouting could rival. The studio audience, usually restrained in political settings, couldn't help themselves. Gasps grew louder, someone clapped before catching themselves, and the moderator struggled to maintain order. Waters' face tightened further, her words now carrying strain rather than dominance. She reached for the familiar weapons of authority, but each time, Crockett's calm dismantled them, leaving nothing but echoes behind. Step by step, Crockett guided the conversation toward a moral clarity that felt undeniable. She didn't debate numbers or statistics. She spoke of dignity, of service, of the responsibility leaders owe to those watching from the margins. Her words transcended politics. They spoke to identity, to pride, to the unyielding truth that no one, regardless of seniority, owns the future. Her final blow was delivered not with a roar, but with silence preceding it. She waited, letting the air stretch thin, letting every viewer lean forward as though drawn by gravity. Then she spoke, softly but unmistakably, "Power that fears new voices is not power. It is insecurity dressed as legacy." The sentence detonated. The room seemed to shake, not from noise, but from the weight of what had just been spoken. Viewers at home felt it viscerally, like a chord struck deep inside. On social media, the quote was already going viral, typed and retweeted in capital letters, repeated like scripture. Commentators scrambled to analyze, but no analysis could capture the raw impact of hearing it live. Waters opened her mouth to respond, but for the first time that evening, no words came. Her silence said more than a rebuttal ever could. The camera zoomed in on her face, the slight tremor in her expression betraying what years of dominance had always concealed: vulnerability. And in that moment, the contrast was undeniable. One woman burning with fury, another illuminated by composure. The torch of credibility was shifting in real time. The audience murmurs swelled into something almost audible across the nation. People texted their friends, posted their shock, declared they had just witnessed a mic drop moment for the ages. Some called it bravery, others called it destiny. But everyone agreed. It was unforgettable. The younger generation had not just defended itself, it had redefined the terms of the battle. Crockett leaned back slightly, not in arrogance but in closure, as though she had said what needed to be said, and nothing more. She didn't chase the reaction. She didn't revel in the applause. She simply let the silence that followed act as her punctuation mark, her exclamation delivered through calm restraint. The silence was louder than any cheer could have been. And as millions sat stunned, replaying the line in their heads, one truth became clear: this wasn't just a rebuttal. This wasn't just a clapback. This wasn't even just a victory in debate. This was a seismic moment, a reframing of what leadership could look like when dignity stood against ego. What followed wasn't just political theater. It was cultural history. The debate may have ended when the cameras stopped rolling, but the conversation was only just beginning. Within minutes of Crockett's mic drop counterattack, social media erupted into a frenzy, unlike anything the political world had seen in years. It wasn't just trending. It was dominating the internet. On Twitter, hashtags like "for Team Crockett," "Find Waters Clapback," and "for Mic Drop Moment" surged to the top of the charts. On TikTok, users clipped the final exchange, adding dramatic music, slow motion effects, and reaction videos that spread like wildfire. By midnight, the face-off had transcended politics. It had become entertainment, culture, and commentary all rolled into one. Late-night comedians seized the moment, opening their monologues with side-by-side clips of Waters' stern rebuke and Crockett's devastating response. Punchlines wrote themselves. That wasn't a debate. It was a political earthquake, quipped one host, to roaring laughter. Another joked. Maxine Waters brought decades of experience, but Jasmine Crockett brought the receipts. The laughter wasn't just humor. It was a signal that this was no ordinary debate exchange. This was a cultural phenomenon. On Instagram, the battle became a meme machine. One viral edit showed Crockett calmly sipping water after her final line, with the caption, "How to End a Dynasty in Under 30 Seconds." Another split screened Waters' stunned silence with Michael Jordan's iconic, "And I took that personally" meme. These weren't just jokes. They were digital markers of a generational shift. Celebrities soon joined in. Musicians, actors, and athletes reposted Crockett's mic drop, often with emojis of fire or clapping hands. List stars tweeted about witnessing history. Civil rights leaders weighed in too, some praising the dignity of Crockett's performance, others noting the historic symbolism of a younger black woman challenging a senior figure of power without losing composure. Even political opponents chimed in, not necessarily siding with Crockett's ideology, but admiring the clarity and calm of her delivery. It was rare to see a moment so widely acknowledged across ideological lines, but this was one of them. Cable news networks, always eager for drama, replayed the clip every hour on the hour. Analysts dissected every pause, every facial twitch, every line of Crockett's rebuttal. Was it pre-planned or spontaneous? Did Waters underestimate her? How would this shift the balance of influence among Democratic leaders? Panels debated endlessly, but one conclusion kept resurfacing: Crockett had emerged as the unexpected victor. What stunned so many was not simply that she won the exchange, but how she won it. In a political culture addicted to outrage, Crockett had wielded restraint as her sharpest weapon. Commentators marveled that she managed to land the knockout blow without raising her voice, without personal attack, without theatrics. It was a lesson in the quiet power of composure, one that felt refreshing in an era of viral meltdowns. Meanwhile, everyday Americans weighed in. Some said the moment reminded them of generational clashes within their own families, the elders insisting their way was the only way, the younger voices pushing for space to define a new path. Others said Crockett gave them hope that dignity could still shine through in a political system too often defined by cynicism. Social media feeds were full of ordinary people saying, "Finally, someone said what needed to be said." But the fallout wasn't universally celebratory. Waters still had loyal defenders, many of whom argued that Crockett's remarks, while powerful, underestimated the decades of sacrifice that built the very platforms younger leaders now stand on. Op-eds appeared, suggesting that Crockett's mic drop might widen divides between the old guard and the new wave, potentially fracturing unity at a moment when it was needed most. And yet, even among critics, there was an acknowledgement something had shifted. The debate had sparked conversations in classrooms, workplaces, and dinner tables about legacy, respect, and the definition of leadership. The clip wasn't just replayed. It was studied, analyzed, debated as though it were a scene from history textbooks rather than a cable news broadcast. The cultural ripple effects grew larger with each passing day. Universities began inviting Crockett for guest lectures. Podcasts dissected her rhetoric as a case study in modern persuasion. Brands even flirted with referencing her mic drop moment in ads, hoping to tap into the wave of cultural relevance. In less than a week, she had gone from a rising political figure to a household name. But perhaps the most telling indicator of the moment's power was the way it unsettled the very structure of political discourse. Suddenly, other young politicians saw permission to challenge entrenched authority more openly. The idea that seniority rules the room no longer felt untouchable. Crockett's composure had cracked that foundation, and the reverberations promised to reshape future debates. And yet, for all the noise, all the memes, all the headlines, a quieter truth lingered beneath the surface. This was more than a viral clip. It was a generational message, one that suggested America was ready, desperate, even, for leadership defined not by volume or years in office, but by clarity, authenticity, and courage. The world was laughing, clapping, retweeting, and arguing. But behind the noise, a deeper lesson was being learned. When the dust settled and the headlines began to fade, one truth remained impossible to ignore. This clash was never just about two women sparring under the bright lights of live television. It was something deeper, more profound. It was about the values that define not only politics, but the spirit of a nation still struggling to find its voice in a fractured age. In Maxine Waters, America saw the embodiment of an era forged by fire. An elder who had built her authority on sharp words, unwavering defiance, and the belief that leadership meant never conceding ground. In Jasmine Crockett, America witnessed the future stepping forward, unshaken, unapologetic, carrying with her the authenticity of lived experience and the dignity of restraint. Their confrontation wasn't a petty feud. It was a mirror held up to a country wrestling with its past and reaching for its future. This was truth against ego, dignity against arrogance, authenticity against performance. And in that moment, the nation was reminded that the real measure of leadership isn't found in volume or seniority, but in clarity, courage, and conviction. The lesson stretched far beyond the Capitol floor. It spoke to immigrants who had arrived on American soil with nothing but hope, reminded that resilience and quiet determination can outlast even the loudest opposition. It spoke to young people watching from dorm rooms and living rooms, seeing proof that their voices, though often dismissed, carried the power to disrupt traditions and demand respect. And it spoke to every person who had ever been underestimated, showing them that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers with precision and leaves a mark that cannot be erased. For decades, Americans have wrestled with the question of what defines leadership in a democracy that is constantly evolving. Is it tenure? Is it bravado? Or is it something more timeless? The ability to rise above pettiness and speak with a dignity that silences chaos. That night, the answer was undeniable. Crockett proved that when dignity speaks, arrogance crumbles. This wasn't simply a win for one politician or a loss for another. It was a cultural lesson. It reminded America that progress has always come from the courage of those willing to speak truth, even when tradition stands in their way. It reminded us that resilience is not only about surviving storms, but about carrying yourself with grace when those storms rage at their fiercest. And it reminded us that democracy itself depends on voices willing to call out false power with quiet strength. The confrontation will live on in viral clips and late-night jokes, but its legacy will endure because it illuminated a timeless principle: authenticity cannot be manufactured, and dignity cannot be destroyed. The old guard may command history, but the new guard shapes destiny. That night, destiny shifted. And so, as Americans replayed the moment again and again, what they carried with them wasn't just entertainment. It was validation, inspiration, a spark of hope that leadership rooted in truth can still rise above the noise. Millions watched, millions gasped, and millions understood. This was more than a political skirmish. It was a glimpse of the America we still have the chance to become. Because in the end, the story was never truly about Waters or Crockett. It was about us. About what we reward, what we remember, and what we demand from those who claim to speak for us. The debate's most powerful message wasn't uttered in anger or in triumph. It was etched in the silence after the mic drop, in the collective realization that authenticity is unstoppable when it finally finds its moment. And that's why millions will never forget what happened that night. And so, the moment that began as a fiery clash ended as something far greater, a defining chapter in America's political story. The title said it all: Maxine Waters and Jasmine Crockett face off on live TV. The ending stunned millions, and stunned they were, because in an arena often clouded with noise and arrogance, it was Crockett's brilliance, her calm clarity, her refusal to be dragged into theatrics, that echoed loudest. This wasn't just television. It was a lesson unfolding in real time that truth is louder than power plays, and dignity is stronger than ego. Millions who watched felt that surge of recognition. That here, in one unforgettable exchange, authenticity had proven itself unstoppable. But the story doesn't end on that stage. It lives on with you, the viewer, the citizen, the believer in something bigger than politics. It challenges us to ask, which voices do we lift? Which values do we amplify? Do we stand with arrogance, or do we stand with dignity? If you believe in dignity over arrogance, in truth over noise, in leadership that inspires instead of belittles, then this is your call. Hit that subscribe button and be part of a movement that refuses to settle for empty theater when brilliance can light the way forward. And if this moment stirred something in you, if Crockett's composure reminded you that the fight for justice is never in vain, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let them see that dignity still has a place in America's story. Because nights like this remind us of a simple truth: when brilliance speaks, millions listen. And that's why this moment will never be forgotten.